movie about the biblical Exodus, but a contemporary movie. And the movie itself will be shown on May 5th, and the lecture will be, the important part, May 20th, Wednesday, May 20th. So, Uwe, it's up to you to remind them at the end. And our favorite rabbi will now come to the podium. Oh, I should say, his name is Michael Panitz.
And what was the movie's name?
I already said that. I said we.
Well, I will be talking to you about Defiance for the next hour. Friends, there used to be an expression amongst the Jewish immigrants who came to this country from Tsarist Russia. They would be astounded by the relative freedom that the Jewish people had in the United States as compared to the persecutions that they suffered under the Tsar. And they used to say to each other, only in America. Only in America. So I have to think, only in America would a very reputable retirement community that is chartered within one of the mainline Protestant Christian denominations. Only in America would such an institution have a favorite rabbi. And I am honored and delighted to fill that slot. A quick word about the next film before I spend the rest of the evening on this one. 1961, the famous filmmaker Otto Preminger, that name might ring a bell, created a film from a very powerful novel written by the novelist Leon Uris, U-R-I-S, called Exodus. Now, there was a steamship that was called the President Warfield. I'll be talking more about this next month, but just so that you should know, it plied the route Baltimore to Norfolk, the Chesapeake Bay route. And it put in a full lifetime of service, and it was ready to become razor blades, as they say. The underground defense organization trying to protect the Jewish residents of the land of Israel who were coming under attack as the British were pulling out of the land of Israel. I'll talk more about that next month. Bought the President Warfield as it was on its way to the scrapyard. And they renamed it the Exodus. And it became a ship for taking Jewish refugees from the Holocaust who were being smuggled out of Europe, taking them to the land of Israel. And the British were not allowing them to come in. So the British would often intercept a ship and they would detain its passengers in a British detention camp in Cyprus. Or even a detention camp which was in the land of Israel itself. I'll give you all of that history next month, but that's where the word Exodus comes from, because it was the name of the steamship that was the new name given by the people called the Haganah, which means the self-defense organization. So that's the name of the movie, and that's why it's called that. And the film talks about the difficult birth of the state of Israel, how hard it was for Israel to come into existence, given that there were many who wanted to destroy it at the moment of its birth. So that's next month's film. Then we have one more after that in June, which will be called The Juggler. not well known, starring Kirk Douglas, great actor, that is set in the period of time just after the film Exodus is set. Even though the film The Juggler was made in the 1950s, not in the 1960s, but it's about a slightly later period of time. It's about a man who was a juggler, an entertainer in Germany, very famous, and he thought erroneously that his fame would protect him and his loved ones. It did not. The machinery of the Holocaust captured him. He lost almost everyone who was dear to him. He himself happened to survive, and he comes to Israel broken and embittered. And how does he, quote unquote, come back to life again? So that's the story of The Juggler. Of all the films that we've shown in this series, that may be the one which is least well known, and really it's a hidden gem. The acting is very, very fine, and the story is an important story too. So that is the balance of our program. Fear not, we're already beginning to work on a program for the next season too. Now, quick show of hands. How many of you saw a screening of Defiance within the last couple of weeks? Almost everyone here. Okay, not everyone. So I'll take a moment to tell you the plot of the film. I won't go into all the twists and turns, but the basic plot. It is set in a part of Eastern Europe known as Belarus. Used to be called White Russia, Belarus or Belarusia. Belarus is in the westernmost part of what used to be the Soviet Union. It is to the north of Ukraine and to the east of Poland and to the south of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, just to give you a sense of where it is. Which means that it was right in the path of the Nazi armies when they invaded the Soviet Union. In the second half of my talk, I'll go back and give you the full history of that, but now I just want to give you the plot. The Nazi armies had great success for the first 5-6 months of their invasion. They captured vast amounts of territory, and they murdered hundreds of thousands of Jews. They machine gunned them to death. The worst was in a place called Babi Yar, a ravine right outside of Kiev in Ukraine. They literally machine gunned tens of thousands of Jewish people to death over several days of mass murder. Those Jews who weren't murdered right away were thrown into ghettos. And eventually those ghettos were liquidated. Either the Jewish people were worked to death and malnourished to death in the ghettos, or they were taken out to death camps and murdered there. Our story is about 3 brothers who actually existed. Their name is Bielski, Bielski. And it's the story about the Bielski brothers who had a real sense that it would be fatal to go into the ghettos. No one can know what tomorrow brings, but they understood that there's no way of outlasting this Nazi menace. We have to get away from it. And when most of the rest of the Jews of Eastern Europe who were not systematically slaughtered were herded into ghettos, they escaped to the forests. I'll be talking more about this too. There were some very forested regions in Belarus, and the topography is important for the story because the forest allows them to hide. At first, we only see 2 of the brothers, Tuvia and Zeus. Tuvia is portrayed by the very famous actor Daniel Craig. Equally famous actor Liev Schreiber portrayed his younger brother Zeus. And then they found a third brother, Asael, who had been in hiding. And all of them are in the forest, really not knowing initially what they're going to do, except survival is all they can think about. And they begin running into other Jewish refugees who had fled from the Nazi death machine and were likewise in the forest. Liev is the more hard-nosed one in certain ways, and he doesn't want to take responsibility for these others. How can they even find food for themselves, not to starve, let alone others too? But Tuvia, the oldest brother, gives the final decision that no, we will accept anyone who wants to band with us, and we will stay here in the forests and hide away from the Nazis, and we'll find a way to survive. That will be our resistance. They want to kill us, we will stay alive. Over the course of time, they develop an entire camp, and they build deep in the forest, and they have sentries and so on and so forth. The two brothers have differences of opinion over what should we be doing. Tuvia was more focused on save all these refugees. That's our mission. Zeus's, the actor is Liev. Zeus's idea is we have to actively fight against the Nazi invaders. And at one point they part company. They have a very difficult falling out, and Zeus parts company and goes to join a Soviet partisan group. And I'll be talking about partisans as well, but in one sentence, the partisans were Soviet soldiers or civilians who found themselves behind the German front lines as the Wehrmacht army advanced eastward, and it went past Belarus all the way to the gates of Moscow. There were all of these people, Russians, who were left behind the lines, who began to organize themselves as an irregular fighting force to do various acts of sabotage against the Nazi army, to fight back in whatever way possible. So the group of the partisans who agree with Zeus that we need to be actively fighting them go off and they join the Soviet partisans, while the larger group under Tuvia remain, and they have a kind of a relationship between the two groups. Tuvia's people will operate machines to repair items that are broken as they're used by the war fighters. They provide a logistical base of support for them, and so they have some connection. The crisis in the film happens when the Soviet partisans receive an order from their own high command to retreat further east. In other words, not to be in a position to be in contact with the larger group of partisans. And the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, conducts reconnaissance, and they find the group, and then they bring in a Wehrmacht land army to eradicate them. And at the last minute, when it looks as if all hope is lost, we see that Zeus's small brigade of soldiers did not agree with the retreat order, because then they couldn't protect their fellow Jewish refugees. And they came and they attacked the German force from behind and saved the refugees. At just the last minute, the two brothers embrace, and they are also reconciled. At the end of the film, you then have a little title card which tells you as a fact that the refugee camp continued to exist for 2 more years until it was no longer necessary for them to be refugees, because finally the Red Army, the Soviet army, counterattacked and liberated that part of Belarus from Nazi control. And that in total, about 1,200 Jewish refugees were saved by being part of that camp. 1,200, it's a very significant number. Finding food for all of them in the dead of the forest in the wintertime, right? And that eventually, by the time that the book Defiance was written by a historian in the 1990s, the number of descendants of those 1,200 people rescued by the Bielski brothers was in the tens of thousands. So at the time that this history was written and then of course made into a movie, tens of thousands of people were alive because of their deeds from 1941 through 1944. So that's the movie in brief. I've left out some of the twists and turns. So-and-so has a girlfriend, and so-and-so is pregnant, and all of that stuff. Much of it is based on actual details of the lives of the refugees in that camp, and some of it, as you understand, is Hollywood. Right. So please come join us. Well, welcome. What I would like to do now is go back and give you a historian's report on what happened. And you will see that a great deal of the story is well based on fact. Some is not, and I've indicated on the bottom of the second page of my study guide where there are historical inaccuracies. Do we have anyone here who is a medical doctor or registered nurse or pharmacist? Pharmacist, right? A nurse? Nurse. Okay, do you know what ampicillin is? Ampicillin? Yes, ampicillin. It's in the penicillin family, I think, right? So ampicillin was discovered in 1958. Before your time, but trust me, I'm a historian. So the movie depicts the Bielski brothers breaking into a local Nazi-run medical place so that they can steal the ampicillin and use it to treat some of their own. Obviously, that's not possible. What they had available to them, I would guess, would have been sulfa drugs. Nothing from the penicillin family. It was first being developed in the West, and you might know that penicillin was a discovery of Alexander Fleming, the British researcher. And the Western powers began to have access to it even during the war years. By the way, it was very hard to get it for civilian use. I want to tell you a true story. You know, sometimes I depart to tell you true stories from my family. My mother, of blessed memory, who was born in 1922, she lived until 2004. But she almost perished in 1943 because she came down with pneumonia. And in 1943, the treatment options for pneumonia were not as advanced as they are now, basically because penicillin and that family of drugs were not available. And my mother told me that she recollected, being in a high fever and scarcely aware of her surroundings, and her grandmother was still alive. She remembers her grandmother standing at her bedside and just weeping, because from the grandmother's perspective, and think about it, the grandmother would have been born in the 1860s, and she was an elderly woman in 1943. She saw this as a death sentence for her darling granddaughter, age 21. So what happened was that my mother's uncle, my mother's father's brother, was a pharmacist, and he was able to obtain some penicillin, which normally wasn't available for civilian use, and that's what saved her life. in 1940. A true story. So,
You might not be here.
well, whoever I would be would have been different. Right. Right. Now, my parents were married in 1942, but I was not born until 1955, which means in 1943 I wasn't even a twinkle in you-know-whose eye. So yes, whoever would have been standing before you would have been someone not quite me, right? Okay, so there are other discrepancies as well, but I would say as Hollywood goes, this is pretty well founded, in fact. And now I want to give you the historical picture in general. The Nazi state begins with the election of Adolf Hitler and his appointment to the last cabinet of the Weimar Republic. He outmaneuvered his rivals, and the president of the Weimar Republic, the war hero Hindenburg, the famous World War I German general, appointed Hitler the chancellor. Shortly after that, there was a fire in their parliament building, the Reichstag, suspicious origins. Hitler used the hysteria around that to have the deputies grant him temporary, unrestricted dictatorial power. He never relinquished it. Okay, that's the day that democracy died in Germany. Hitler was democratically elected, and within a month he had dismantled democracy in Germany. His popularity in Germany was based on the fact that he seemed to be the model of success for them to get out from under the oppressive regime that they saw the British and the French had saddled them with the Treaty of Versailles. So he set about challenging and dismantling all of those restrictions. Reached a culminating point in the fall of 1938 when, actually I'll go back a little bit. The hills are alive with the sound of music, okay? Where is that set? Austria, okay? Edelweiss, right? Okay, so the von Trapp family of singers are depicted as being the father, mother, and children, and the father is an Austrian patriot, anti-Nazi. And at the very end of the film, they make their escape. Remember that? Well, in truth, many Austrians were like the young man who courts the oldest daughter, totally pro-Nazi, because they thought that Hitler was their rising star. And so Austria and Germany became united, after which Hitler set his sights upon the next country nearby, which had a sizable ethnic German minority, and that was what was then called Czechoslovakia. Today, of course, it's two separate countries. It's Slovakia and the Czech Republic, but then it was Czechoslovakia, created from the breakup of the Habsburg Austrian Empire in 1919. And Hitler demanded that part of that country, which had German ethnic population in it, it was called the Sudetenland, that it be handed over to Germany. The Czechs were ready to fight for their territorial integrity. The French were willing to fight for the territorial integrity of the Czech state. The British caved. The British Prime Minister was a man named Neville Chamberlain. He flew to Munich and he agreed to appease Hitler, because Hitler said to him that with this, my territorial ambition is complete. We have all the German ethnic enclaves now within our Reich, which is our natural borders. Chamberlain came back to England and said that he has secured, quote unquote, peace in our time. Boy, was he wrong. It didn't take 12 months for the Second World War to start because Hitler, in fact, did not intend to stop with the inclusion of all ethnic Germans in the borders of the Reich. He wanted something that was called Lebensraum, okay, space to live, space to spread out. He wanted to colonize parts of Europe that were not already home to ethnic Germans. They were home to Slavs. And what would he do about the Slavs? Well, he would enslave them, kill them, and of course, any Jews he found there, he would kill right away. So that's what led to his designs upon Poland. And the British and the French went to war against Hitler when he, in fact, invaded Poland. He invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. The British and French delivered an ultimatum, which he, of course, ignored, and they went to war on the 3rd of September, 1939. Now, what Westerners sometimes forget is that just before that invasion, Hitler pulled off a diplomatic coup. His foreign minister, whose name was Ribbentrop, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and the Soviet Union's foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov. Later on, you heard about the Molotov cocktail, right? I guarantee that's not something you get at the bar. It's higher octane than anything you get at the bar. So Molotov and Ribbentrop signed something called the Pact of Steel, essentially which made Hitler and Stalin allies in the dismemberment of Poland. So when Hitler invaded Poland on September 1st, Stalin, after a few days waiting, invaded the eastern part of Poland. And in essence, those two dictatorships partitioned Poland between them. Poland went out of existence. Stalin remained Hitler's ally for the next year and 3/4. But Hitler double-crossed him, as indeed he was going to do all along. It's still a surprise that historians try to ponder that someone as suspicious and paranoid as Joseph Stalin, one of the most paranoid people in history, that he was so completely bamboozled by Hitler. In fact, he was still authorizing shipments by railway of goods that the Nazi Empire wanted at the moment of the invasion. The invasion took place on June 22nd, 1941. And here too, I'm going to pause and tell you a story from my personal family. In this case, my wife's family. My wife's father and mother were Jewish people who lived in the city of Lodz, L-O-D-Z, which is a textile manufacturing city in western Poland. When the Nazis invaded Poland, they immediately captured Lodz and put the Jews in the ghetto. But before the ghetto was completely sealed up, my mother-in-law convinced her husband to escape in the confusion and settle in a big town on the Soviet side of partitioned Poland, a town which today is called Ivano-Frankivsk. It's in Ukraine today, but it used to be a big railway hub in Poland called Stanislavov. My mother-in-law was able to pass as a Gentile. She had red hair and an upturned nose, and she didn't quote-unquote look Jewish, whatever that might mean. Also, and this is critical, she did not speak Polish with a Yiddish accent. Why? Because her parents, although they lived in Poland, they were Zionists. They spoke Polish and they spoke Hebrew. They understood Yiddish, but they didn't speak it in the home. They went to the land of Israel because they wanted to be pioneers there in the 1920s. But economic conditions were very, very tough. Think of the Great Depression and so on and so forth. My mother-in-law's father died on a business trip, and my mother-in-law's mother and the teenage children went back to Lodz. So my mother-in-law was living in Lodz when the Nazis invaded. She managed to get out of the ghetto with her infant daughter. My sister-in-law, June, who's still alive, lives in Virginia Beach. She might be, I don't know, the youngest Holocaust survivor. She was born in May of 1939, just before the Nazi invasion. She was 4 months old when the Nazis invaded. She might be one of the very youngest people alive who was alive at the beginning of the Second World War and is still alive today as a survivor, a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust. Anyway, my mother-in-law had the problem of traveling with the baby. She didn't think that she could keep the baby alive during the harsh Polish winter months. So she waited until April of 1940, dressed as a washerwoman, had a huge pile of rags with the baby concealed in the pile of rags, and she somehow talked her way past the guard. She told the guard that she was a washerwoman who worked for the commandant, and he'd sent her here because they were confiscating some property, and if he didn't let her pass, the guard's boss would hear about it. And apparently she let fly with such curses that he believed that only a Polish washerwoman could have a command of such a vocabulary. It's an amazing story. She crossed the border between German-occupied and Soviet-occupied Poland and was put into jail as an illegal border crosser. But she was able to get word to her husband, who bailed her out of jail. So they were living there in Stanislavov, which was called Ivano-Frankovsk by the Russians. Today it's called Ivano-Frankivsk by the Ukrainians. June 22nd, 1941. Here's the part of the story I want you to remember. The Luftwaffe starts bombing the railway station in Stanislavov as part of the invasion of the Soviet Union. My mother-in-law and father-in-law and sister-in-law are in a whole avalanche of people trying to get as far east as possible. Ultimately, they made it as far as Almaty in Kazakhstan, where that was the end of the line. They got off the train. They had to register with the Polish embassy in exile. And because my father-in-law had medical training from before the war, he was drafted into the Red Army, and he worked in what we call MASH, Mobile Army Field Hospitals. He worked in a Red Army, Soviet Army field hospital for the rest of the war. That's how they survived. But on that day, picture this if you could. Big 19th century style train station. Right? If you've been to England, you know what these Victorian era train stations look like. There's a platform and there's trains on either side of the platform. And both of those trains are going to head east. I mean, no one's heading west anymore. The Luftwaffe had different kinds of bombers. One was called a Stuka. Did you ever hear about a Stuka? It was a dive bomber. In other words, it would go into a very steep dive and it would release its bomb, and then it would bank and come back up again. It was terrifying. The two trains waiting to leave the station, the Stuka dive bombs, destroys the other train on the other side of the platform, and their train escaped. Just the luck of the draw that they went on this train and not that train. If they'd have turned left instead of right or right instead of left, they would have been killed on June 22nd, 1941. True story from my family. So the Wehrmacht catches the Red Army totally by surprise. To make matters worse for the Soviets, Stalin, the paranoid, had purged his army of all of its best generals because he was afraid they might lead a mutiny against him. So the Red Army was commanded by second echelon people at best. To make matters still worse, Stalin fancied himself a military genius and would give orders for the troops not to retreat and withdraw when they needed to do that so that they could regroup. Consequently, in the early weeks of the war, Soviet soldiers were captured by the hundreds of thousands. Most of them either starved to death at Nazi hands, or were worked to death, or were brutalized, or were otherwise killed by the Nazis. Very, very, very few of those Soviet prisoners of war ever survived. And ironically, those who did were met with suspicion by Stalin's Soviets when they came back. Were you a collaborator? Is that why you survived? If you want to read a very powerful novel on that subject, I recommend you read a novel by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, if you know that name, the great Russian author, called A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, basically about his own life. Captured by the Germans, happened to survive, not because he was a collaborator, but he happened to survive. When he gets back to the Soviet Union, they send him to a labor camp in Siberia, because they don't believe he could have survived if he hadn't been a collaborator. So the Wehrmacht is making very quick advances, and it captures Belarus within a matter of a few weeks. So now we're into the mid to late summer of 1941. Most of the Jews of that region were not sent to concentration camps. They were murdered on the spot. The invaders, the Nazi invaders, planned to have specialized killing squads. They were called Einsatzgruppen. And their job was to machine gun any Jews they found. So that is the history. That's not Hollywood at all. But there were some ghettos, and there were some Jews who escaped from the ghettos, or who escaped before being herded into the ghettos. Now, in terms of the history of the war, the Wehrmacht expected a fairly quick and relatively easy victory, because as of June of 1941, they had not faced any really first-class armies. All their victories had been quite easy for them. The Soviet Union, though, is a huge place, and the Soviet army, although it was badly led and suffered grievous losses, enough of them were able to retreat and continue fighting. Moreover, climate worked against the Wehrmacht. It was the earliest, coldest winter on record for a long, long time. Now, the Nazi combined arms tactics involved the use of tanks in a way which no army had used before. Instead of one tank to this battalion and one tank to that battalion, they grouped them together to punch holes through the line of the enemy's resistance, to fragment the enemy's line of resistance. Then the infantry would come through and encircle them, and so on and so forth. So if the tanks can't start because it's too cold for their engines, that makes the German military superiority much less. Another fact which is often forgotten, Stalin had a very important asset, a spy in Tokyo who worked for the Japanese Foreign Ministry, who was in a position to learn that the Imperial Japanese High Command, although they were nominally allies with Hitler, nominally, they had decided not to attack the Soviet Union across their common frontier in Manchuria. They decided that they weren't going to open up that front because they were preparing for Pearl Harbor, and they wanted to have all of their forces available for defending against the inevitable American counterattack. So Stalin was able to take almost all of his troops who were stationed in the Far East and send them to the region of Moscow using the Trans-Siberian Railway. And on December 8th, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor, as it happens, these fresh Soviet troops counterattacked against the Germans. And they pushed them back a few miles, and the lines stopped, and they held in place for that winter. Let me tell you how close it was. The Nazis got as far as the outskirts of Moscow. The Moscow light rail, the trolleys, actually went to the place where the Nazis had reached. So in other words, they were as close to the Kremlin as we are close to, I don't know, the Performing Arts Center in Newport News. Right, what is that, 5 miles from here, 10 miles from here? Right? That's how close they were. Certainly within range of their big guns. Now, in the springtime, the Germans renewed their offensive, but this time they tried to go to a region which was less well defended, and they went not straight east or northeast, they went southeast towards the Volga River, trying to capture places like Azerbaijan with its oil wells and get all of those natural resources. And they got as far as the Volga River, where they were stopped finally in a decisive battle called Stalingrad, where now Hitler is making the same mistakes as Stalin made at the beginning of the war, and Hitler would not allow his troops to withdraw in order to avoid encirclement and capture. And although it was a very, very, very heavy battle with losses on the Russian side too, ultimately it became the turning point in the war. From that point on, January of 1943, the Red Army was consistently on the offensive. Now, they had a lot of ground to cover, right? The Nazis were deep, deep, deep inside of the Soviet Union. So the Red Army did not achieve pushing the Wehrmacht out of occupied Russia until the summer of 1944. So it was a year and a half of very bloody fighting before they got into Poland and Romania and Bulgaria and that area, Yugoslavia, or in the north, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and so on. And then it was basically one more year from July of 1944 till the beginning of May of 1945 to finish the destruction of the Third Reich. We Americans had plenty of fighting that we did, starting with Pearl Harbor, but we had an air war against the Nazi regime. Are you familiar with a movie called 12 O'Clock High, starring Gregory Peck, by Darrell F. Zanuck, about the 8th Army Air Force based in England and the terrible losses that they suffered. But you probably also know the story of D-Day. You might remember The Longest Day, or you might remember Saving Private Ryan. Stories about the American, British, Canadian, Free French combined liberation of Western Europe from the boot of the Nazi tyrant. But while America was doing that, the bulk of the fighting was happening on the Eastern Front, just in terms of how many divisions of soldiers were involved. There was always much, much more happening on the Eastern Front than happened on the Western Front. Now, we are especially looking at Belarus, because that's where our story takes place, in those forests of Belarus. So the question is, when was Belarus captured by the Nazis, and when was it liberated by the Soviets? And the answer was captured by June, July of 1941, and it wasn't liberated until about that same time, 3 years later. So the time period when the Nazis were in control in Belarus was about 3 years, during which time they perpetrated endless persecution of the locals. They did all sorts of damage. I'd like to read to you a couple of excerpts from a very fine book written by a man named Alexander Worth, W-E-R-T-H. It's a heavy book. It's called Russia at War, 1941 to 1945. And he was the chief BBC war correspondent stationed in the Soviet Union throughout the wartime period. So let me just share with you a couple of excerpts of what he says. I'm quoting him now. Nearly every liberated town and village in Russia, Belarusia, or the Ukraine had something terrible to tell. In Belarusia, today we call it Belarus, hundreds of villages in alleged, quote, partisan country had been burned down and their inhabitants either murdered or deported. Everywhere, large cities had been systematically destroyed. Every Ukrainian and Belarusian city had its own horror story. As the Red Army advanced to the west, it heard these daily stories of terror and humiliation and deportations. It saw the destroyed cities. It saw the mass graves of Russian war prisoners murdered or starved to death. It saw Babi Yar with its countless corpses, among them the corpses of small children. And in the Russian soldier's mind, the real truth on Nazi Germany, with its Hitler and Himmler and its Untermensch philosophy and its unspeakable sadism, became hideously tangible. For wherever the Germans had passed, there was a stench of decaying corpses. So the devastation in Belarus was vast. The rear areas behind the front lines was where the Soviet partisans were operating. And I now want to tell you what is the actual history of that. Remember that the Wehrmacht advance in 1941 was very rapid. So rapid that many Red Army Soviet troops were separated from their command in the melee of war. They didn't participate in any kind of orderly retreat. They often found themselves in hiding, and those forests, there's some very heavily forested areas in Belarus, which is the scenery of where our story takes place. Many partisans found refuge there, not only Jewish partisans. Starting already in 1941, the Kremlin began to recognize that there was military value in these partisans. And it tried to establish communications with them, and it tried to supply them in various ways. They would sometimes fly very small planes that could land on just the most rude, improvised landing strip and bring in some needed supplies for war making. By 1943, the number of partisans was increasing because, first of all, the Soviet leadership got better at supplying them, and secondly, the inhabitants of Ukraine and Belarus and the western parts of Russia and so on and so forth saw how horribly they were being treated by the Nazi conquerors, that there was, some were too afraid to do anything, and some were emboldened in order to become partisans. Now, most of these partisan groups did not have Jewish fighters in them. Why is that? That's because very few Jews survived. Most were murdered. Of those who did survive, the partisan groups tended to shun them. They themselves were anti-Semitic. And you see a scene of that in the film, where one of the Jewish members of Zusbilski's partisan group gets beaten up. What was his crime? It's like the worst of Jim Crow. You know how there were segregated bathrooms here? Actually, right in these parts, right? Well, this Jewish soldier dared to use a latrine reserved for the Russians, not for the Jews. So he got beaten up horribly. That sort of thing happened. Interestingly enough, what I learned from this history book is that the one kind of Jewish personnel that you're likely to have seen in these non-Jewish partisan groups was the camp doctor. Interestingly enough, there was such a shortage of medical personnel, let alone a shortage of medicine, of course. But there was such a shortage of medical personnel that the partisan groups were reduced to, quote unquote, that they even had to accept the Jew as their doctor, because otherwise there'd be no doctors at all. So let me read to you again an important quote from this history book about the partisans. Talking about regions where the partisans were able to have a little bit of de facto control. Such partisan regions were to be found, I'm quoting from my history book, found in the northern wooded parts of the Ukraine, in large parts of Belarusia, in the Bryansk forests, in the Orel provinces, where 18,000 partisans belonging to 54 detachments. You heard the Russian word otriad, which means a detachment, like a regiment, controlled an area comprising 490 villages. So that's the part of the region where our movie is set. So this is true. That was a region of partisan concentration, and they controlled it, but it doesn't mean they controlled it to the point where it was peaceful to live there. There were still armed Wehrmacht patrols going through, and the partisans were never armed to the point where they could have a conventional stand-up fight against the Wehrmacht. They didn't have tanks, they didn't have artillery, right? What they tended to do was acts of sabotage. Consider this. Napoleon, before the age of the railroad, said that an army marches on its stomach. You probably know that, the dictum, right? One of the aspects of the American Civil War and every European war from that point on is that the sinews of the war machines, the armies, were fed by railroads. If you look at the Civil War campaigns, those of you who are Civil War buffs, and you put that up against the railroad network of America in 1861, you'll see to what extent this is true. So if you are a Russian partisan, what you want to do is prevent the supply trains leaving from Germany to reach the German army deep in Russia. So most of what they did was blow up train tracks. And we saw that in our film. We saw where Lev is being instructed by one of the Soviet partisans how to blow up a train track. He had something like a mine, and he used a playing card so that the mine's detonator wouldn't go off. And then he pulled the playing card out so that when the train would come over the track, the weight of the train would push the track down, and it would explode it. They did that. Occasionally, that was centrally coordinated. And I'll give you one statistic. The Soviets had a coordinated attack against the railroads that the Nazis were using on the night of July 20th, 21st, 1944. Part of their attempt to push the Germans out of Russia was to destroy the railroads by which the German army was getting resupplied. It makes sense, right? So listen to this statistic. On the night of July 20th, 21st, 5,800 rails were blown up. That takes a lot of coordination. And in our part of the country that our movie is set in, altogether between July 21st and September 27th, the Orel and Bryansk partisans, that's exactly the region we're looking at, Bryansk, blew up over 17,000 rails. They succeeded in blocking one of the key railroads used by the Wehrmacht for 10 days on end in the summer of 1943. So the movie is set in a very difficult time and place. As hard as the movie was to watch, the reality was even worse. Ultimately, although the movie ends with a very particular high point in the story, it's not at all the end of the history story. What happened was the Red Army would get to a certain area, and many of the partisans would automatically be drafted into the Red Army. Now, the younger ones were usually willing to serve because they were fighting against Nazis. Now they could continue to fight against Nazis, and now they'd get fed 3 meals a day, and they'd get decent military equipment to use, and so on and so forth. The older ones remembered that they didn't trust the Soviet high command for all sorts of reasons. But here's a very interesting statistic. Every one of these partisans who's getting inducted into the Red Army had to pass a medical physical, just as every inductee has to pass a medical physical. 1/5 of all of them failed. Do you know why? Vast majority of those who failed, tuberculosis. So think about it. Before the Red Army liberated where they were fighting right through their TB. Once they're liberated and they have to pass a physical, they're sidelined because they're in fact too sick to fight. It didn't stop them from fighting, but they were too sick to fight at that point on. Now, as to the Bielski brothers, I want to finish with a little comment about the two of them, because they really did exist. There was a third Bielski brother whom we saw in the film, and he was killed in the fighting. He became part of the regular Soviet army, and he was killed before the end of the war. The two oldest ones, Tuvia and Zeus, survived the war, came to America, and settled in New York City, where they opened up and operated a small trucking business. I was working in New York City in the late 1980s and the early 1990s before I came to serve the Jewish congregation in Norfolk. And I remember a couple of news stories, not prominent news stories, a couple of news stories about the Bielski brothers. Because another book had come out in the 1980s, and it sparked a whole new wave of interest in aspects of the Second World War and the Holocaust. You know this book, I think. It's called Schindler's List. You've heard that book? Schindler, written by the Australian journalist Thomas Keneally. A true story about a German industrialist named Oskar Schindler, who at first was making money hand over fist using Jewish slave labor from the ghetto of Krakow, and who then had a stirring of his conscience and decided that the Jewish people that he was working as slave laborers would become his protected Jews. And they continued to work for him in his factories, but they were no longer subject to beatings and intimidation and then just liquidation. And as his factory was evacuated by the German authorities deeper and deeper into places like Czechoslovakia, because it was producing items that the German army wanted to use, he protected those Jews. I actually knew a woman who was one of those protected Jews, and she lived in Norfolk, and she and I would do joint lectures where she would tell her story and I would tell the historical context of it. Anyway, Schindler's List created a great interest in what are the human interest stories from the Holocaust that we haven't told. And ever since then, it's been more and more on that same subject. But this is when that was beginning to become a real focus of concern. So in 1993, a Jewish woman who was a Holocaust survivor named Nechama Tek, T-E-C, she was a Polish Jewish woman who had been taken in by Christian neighbors to her parents, who raised her as a Christian girl, and that's what saved her life. Later on, she reconnected with the fact that she is Jewish, and she was able to understand what her full story was, and she wrote the story of the Bielski partisans. They themselves never sought the limelight. They weren't interested in a movie being made about them. When they saw the movie, they naturally focused on the parts that were Hollywood and not the exact history. That's what they say, you didn't get it right. But I understand that because, do you remember we had a series called Band of Brothers? Did you ever see Band of Brothers? About the 101st Airborne, one of their companies. I knew a fellow who was a lieutenant in the Easy Company. He became ultimately a colonel, Colonel Edward Shames. Did you know Eddie Shames?
I've heard about him on the radio.
Yes, a wonderful fellow. He spoke for the first time ever. He spoke about liberating a concentration camp from the pulpit of my congregation. I got him to do it. He just wouldn't do it. It was too, this guy had seen everything in battle. He couldn't talk about that. Until finally he realized, I have to talk about it because there are Holocaust deniers out there today. So Eddie Shames told me that he didn't like the Band of Brothers because they got certain details wrong. So for the same reason, the Bielski brothers themselves didn't like this movie because they got certain things wrong. If you're actually a veteran, then you're not interested in embellishing the story in any Hollywood type way. But I can tell you on a scale of 1 to 10, it's between an 8 and a 9 in terms of its accuracy. Anyway, I hope that it's not a fun thing to watch, but I hope it's been an instructive experience, and very happy to have the chance to contextualize it for you. Happy to take a couple of questions, and then we'll wish ourselves a good month. Questions?
As always, please raise your hand and I'll come to you, and please state your name then for everyone. All right, I'm looking forward, I'm looking back. Okay, we have one question.
This is Tom.
Tom.
The movie shows some of the Jewish partisans who were fighters joining the Russian army.
Yes, that was Zeus, the brother Zeus, his partisans. Yes.
One of the brothers went. And then at the end near the end of the movie, that group of partisans came back to the Jewish group of people.
That's the climax of the movie.
That helped them. Yeah, that was very interesting, I thought.
Well, the reason for that is that the Soviet high command was gradually taking more and more control over these partisan bands. And that particular partisan band, it had ordered to retreat further east, which would have put them out of contact with Tuvia's band. So the Jewish soldiers they didn't retreat with the others. They returned to being just independent partisans. So that's part of that story. And I think that we need to remember that while the Soviets were against the Nazis, they harbored their own deep well of anti-Semitism. We should remember that.
Other comments or questions or observations?
Judy.
All right, Judy has one. Wait for the microphone, please.
And I think we know your name.
Yes, you don't have to state your name, Judy.
At the end of the movie, they had this plaque on the screen that they went on for at least 2 years, and they had built
A hospital, a nursery, right.
Yes, how did they do that?
Well, we see them building in the forest using timbers.
They didn't have tools for that.
Well, they had ways of getting tools. Remember, we can't say that all of the farmers were happy to support the cause. It's not easy being a farmer when, on the one hand, you have the Wehrmacht confiscating most of your crops, and on the other hand, you have the partisans confiscating most of your crops. So, in fact, there's one scene where they stop this guy with a little milk cart, and then at the end we see he's betrayed them. He tells their position, and that's one of the fights between the two brothers. Zeus says to Tuvia, "You should have killed him, because now we almost all got killed because you let him live." And that's the very, very difficult choices that they were confronted with. Yes?
In the beginning,
You have to tell us your name.
in the beginning, they did show the one man with a large saw.
Yes.
He was carrying on his back. I'm guessing that artisans probably carried whatever their skills were, and probably had tools that were not specific.
In fact, I think at one point we saw a sewing machine. Yeah. What was critically in low supply was medicine. The fact that there's one scene where they broke into a place to get medicine, even though it wasn't ampicillin, but that rings true, because many of the lightly wounded fighters died. I can't really call it medical neglect, but from lack of medicine.
The watchmaker was going to fix guns.
Well, because he knew how to work with tools and fine equipment.
All right. And Julie, again, doesn't need to tell her name. We know her.
The watchmaker had tools, yes, but they were little things.
That's right.
How do you build a hospital? How do you build these big buildings?
You liberate them from various sources.
If there is no more question, then let's give the rabbi a round of applause.
I'll finish it and then you finish. We're very grateful that he came back. We look forward to next month, and I hope to see all of you here. You too.
I'll be here too.
And I do not see the list of the dates. Julie, do you have that?
Oh, May 20th. Oh, but I don't know when we're screening it.
So we need both the date of the movie and of the lecture.
The upcoming movie is the 5th. Tuesday, May 5th. Cinco de Mayo.
Yeah, so the next movie will be May 5th indeed, that's a Tuesday. That's the movie Exodus, as Rabbi Panitz has characterized. And then the lecture will be 2 weeks later, but on a Wednesday the 20th.
I do have one recommendation for the screening of the film Exodus. When it first came out in 1961, it was a film on the longer side, so it had an intermission. And I suggest that we also have an intermission because people might want a bathroom break in the middle of watching that film.
Okay. We can easily do that. All right. So we are officially dismissed. Once more, thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.